The moment. Damien Voss threw the envelope across the table. Elena Whitmore finally understood what kind of man she was dealing with. You want to tell me what this is? His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Not the yelling, not the fist on the table, but the quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he had already decided something. Elena looked at the envelope. Her name was on it, written in handwriting she hadn't seen in 6 years. Where did you get that? She asked. Damien didn't answer. He just watched her the way a man watches something he's already calculated, already measured for damage. His jaw was set. His eyes were flat. And in that moment, with the Montana wind hammering the windows and the whole ranch staff pretending not to listen through the walls, Elena realized she hadn't walked into a job. She had walked into something she didn't have a name for yet. If you've ever held something that was meant for someone who never got to read it, if you've ever been the person left behind without an explanation, then you already know how this story ends. But you don't know how it got there. Stay with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is going to go somewhere you're not expecting. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Now let's go back to the beginning. The bus dropped Elena Whitmore at the junction outside Caldwell, Montana on a Thursday morning in early December, and the first thing the cold did was remind her that she had made a mistake. Not the kind of mistake you can fix by turning around. The kind that's already done, already set in motion, and the only thing left is to walk forward into it and hope the ground holds. She had one suitcase, a canvas duffel that had belonged to her mother, patched at the bottom corner with a strip of electrical tape, because the zipper had cracked 2 winters ago and she hadn't had the money to replace it. She had $43 in cash, a folded printout of a job listing, and a phone with 11% battery and no signal. The listing had been brief. Cook needed. Remote ranch, December through March. Housing provided. Serious inquiries only. There had been a phone number but no name. When she'd called, a woman named Greta had answered, asked her 3 questions. Could she cook for 20 people? Could she handle early mornings? And did she have any problem with isolation? And when Elena said no to all 3, Greta said, "We'll take you," and hung up. That was 4 days ago. Elena had sold the last of her good furniture, paid the remaining 2 weeks on her apartment, and gotten on a bus. She stood at that junction for 20 minutes before a truck stopped. It was a ranch truck, old and work-worn, and the man driving it was maybe 60, with a white beard trimmed close and a face that looked like it had been left outside too long. "You the new cook?" he said. "Yes." "Get in." He didn't introduce himself. She didn't ask. They drove for 40 minutes on a road that went from paved to gravel to something that barely qualified as a road at all, and she watched the landscape change, the way Montana in December flattens out and then rises and then flattens again, like the land can't make up its mind. The sky was low and gray and pressed down on everything. "How long you been cooking?" the man finally said. "Since I was 10, Elena said. "My mother ran a diner outside Billings. I grew up behind the counter." "Ranch cooking's different." "I know." "Early, cold. Nobody says thank you." "Sounds like the diner," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The ranch appeared gradually. First a fence line, then a gate with a wrought iron arch that read Voss Legacy in letters that had been elegant once and were now just weather-worn. Then the outbuildings, barns, equipment sheds, a bunkhouse that stretched longer than she expected. And then the main house. It wasn't what she'd pictured. She had imagined a farmhouse, practical, functional, the kind of place built to work. What she saw instead was something that had been built to say something. Stone foundation, timber frame, a porch that wrapped the whole front face of the building. Not a mansion exactly, but a statement. This place belonged to someone who had money and wanted you to know it without having to be told. The man parked and got out without a word, and Elena followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. The entryway was cold, not the brutal cold outside, but the indoor cold of a large space not fully heated, the kind that settles into walls. A woman was waiting. She was maybe 55, heavyset, with iron gray hair pulled back tight, and an expression that suggested she had been doing this long enough that new people were more inconvenience than interest. "You're Elena," the woman said. "Yes." "I'm Greta. I manage the household." She looked at the canvas duffel. then back at Elena's face. Whatever conclusion she reached, she kept it to herself. Kitchen's through here. I'll show you your room and then we'll talk about what's expected. The room was small, a single bed, a dresser, a window that faced the eastern pasture. Clean but not warm, the kind of clean that came from function rather than care. Elena set her duffel on the bed and stood there for a moment looking at the window. Outside, the pasture was brown and frozen, and a fence line ran across it until it disappeared into the low light. She had been in worse places. She reminded herself of that. Greta showed her the kitchen, which was large and commercial-grade in the equipment but worn in the way working kitchens get worn. Grease in the corners, a burner that ran a little hot, storage shelves organized by someone who had their own logic that didn't always make sense from the outside. Elena asked 3 questions, and Greta answered all of them without elaboration. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6, Greta said. 22 people on the property right now, including Mr. Voss. He eats in the main dining room. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. You'll run both. What does Mr. Voss eat? Greta looked at her with something that might have been surprise. What do you mean? Preferences, restrictions, things he doesn't eat. He's not difficult, Greta said, in the tone of someone who meant the exact opposite. Okay, Elena said. She didn't ask anything else. She put on an apron and started looking through the pantry. She didn't meet Damien Voss until the second day. She had cooked breakfast and lunch for the hands, biscuits, gravy, eggs, a pot of chili that she had stretched with what was available, and had sent a tray to the main dining room both times via a young ranch hand named Pedro, who carried it without complaint and came back with the tray empty. So he ate. That was something. She was in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, working through what the pantry had to offer and writing a supply list she was going to need to figure out how to deliver to Greta when she heard footsteps in the hall. Not the shuffling work boot tread of the hands, something different, more deliberate. Damien Voss stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked up. He was taller than she'd imagined from the brief description Greta had given. Not tall like a man who'd been stretched, but tall like a man who'd grown into the space he occupied. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years older, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular kind of face that came from spending years outdoors without caring much about what that did to it. He was wearing a work shirt and jeans, not a suit, which surprised her. She had expected a suit. He looked at her the way he probably looked at new equipment, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Assessing. "You're Elena," he said. "Yes." He looked at the counter, at the list she was making. "Greta said you had questions about supplies." "I have a list," she said. "I can hand it to Greta if that's the process." "What's on it?" She hesitated 1 second, then picked it up and read it to him, straightforwardly, item by item, without editorializing. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The smoked paprika," he said. "It's what I use for the chili base. If it's not available locally, I can substitute." "It's available," he said. "I just want to know if you're making chili or something else." "Something else eventually," she said. "But the hands seemed to need something warm and familiar yesterday. I'll move to other things when I've got a better sense of what works here." He looked at her for a second longer than was strictly comfortable. "Fine," he said. He turned and walked back down the hall. That was it. No pleasantries, no welcome. She stood in the kitchen looking at the empty doorway and thought, okay, that's what we're dealing with. She turned back to her list. The first real test came 3 days in. A winter storm moved in from the northwest in the early afternoon, faster than anyone expected. By 4 o'clock, the wind was up, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the ranch hands who'd been out with the cattle were coming in cold and shaken and short-tempered. Elena could hear them in the mudroom, the banging of boots, raised voices, someone arguing about something that hadn't gone right in the pasture. She had dinner ready at 5:30 instead of 6, because she'd heard the weather report on the kitchen radio and made a judgment call. Beef stew, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, with cornbread she'd made in 2 cast-iron skillets. Not fancy. Not supposed to be. Pedro appeared in the kitchen doorway, stamping snow from his boots even though he was already inside. He was 19 and had the look of someone who hadn't slept enough for several days. "You're early," he said. "Tell the others," she said. He disappeared and she heard the word spread down the hallway. By 5:40, the bunkhouse dining table was full. She stood at the pass-through and watched them eat. Actually watched, because she needed to know what worked. And what she saw was 20 men who had come in from a hard afternoon and were now, for the first time since she'd been here, not arguing. She didn't make much of it. It was just food, but she filed it away. Greta appeared at her elbow. Mr. Voss wants to know if dinner can be moved to the dining room. It's already in the dining room, Elena said. Greta blinked. How did you know he'd want to eat with everyone? I didn't, Elena said. I just figured on a night like this, eating alone in the main dining room seemed like an uncomfortable thing to ask someone to do. Greta looked at her for a long moment. He doesn't usually eat with the hands. He doesn't have to, Elena said, but the option's there. Damien Voss appeared at the main dining room door 20 minutes later. He paused when he saw the room. The tables pushed together, the hands already eating, the bowls of stew and the cornbread. Elena was at the far end, pouring coffee, and she didn't look up when he came in. She heard his footsteps, heard the chair pull back, heard him sit. By the time she looked over, he was eating. He didn't say anything to her that night, but when Pedro came to collect the dishes, he told her that Damien had eaten 2 bowls of stew and asked if there was more cornbread. She made a note to double the batch next time. Hulk. The second week was when things started getting complicated. Not between her and Damien. Not yet. That would come later, slower, the way those things always come. The complicated part at first was the ranch itself. Elena had learned in her first days to listen. Not in a nosy way, not in a way that looked like listening, but in the way that any cook in a working kitchen learns to hear the temperature of a room from the sounds outside it. And what she heard, underneath the daily noise of cattle and equipment and weather, was strain. The hands talked in low voices when they thought no one was near. She caught pieces. A supplier who hadn't delivered. A bank meeting that Damien had come back from 3 days ago, looking like he'd swallowed something wrong. A stretch of fence on the north pasture that needed replacement, but the material hadn't been ordered yet. Small things. But small things like that didn't stay small. She mentioned none of this to Greta. She mentioned none of it to Damien, but she started paying attention to the supply runs and the delivery schedule, and she started adjusting her menus to stretch what she had without making the stretching obvious. Because 22 people eating less than good food on top of everything else was a morale problem she could actually do something about. It was during that second week that she found the room. She had been looking for a storage closet. Greta had mentioned one off the main hallway that held extra linens and some dry goods, and she had opened the wrong door. Simple as that. The wrong door at the end of the hall, which she had assumed was a closet. It wasn't a closet, it was a small room. Maybe a study, once. There was a desk pushed against the far wall and shelves on either side, but it wasn't being used as a study now. The desk was clear except for a single box, and the shelves held things that looked personal rather than functional. A pair of worn work gloves, a hat that was too small to be Damien's, a photograph in a plain frame, a set of books that had the look of being read rather than displayed. And on the desk, in the center of the box, an envelope. She wasn't going to look. That was her first instinct. Back out, close the door, find the right closet. She had no business in this room. But the envelope had slipped slightly sideways in the box, and as she started to pull the door closed, she saw the handwriting on the front. She didn't recognize it immediately. Not right away. It took 3 full seconds, standing in the doorway with her hand on the frame, looking at the slant of the letters, the particular loop on the E at the start, before something cold moved through her chest. That was her handwriting. She stood there for what was probably 15 seconds, but felt like much longer, not moving, not breathing right, just staring at the envelope. The name on the front, the name it was addressed to, was not hers. It was a man's name. A name she hadn't said out loud in 6 years. She picked it up. She shouldn't have. She knew that even as she did it, this was not hers to touch. Not here. Not now. But her hand moved before her better judgment caught up. The envelope was sealed, unopened. She had written this letter. She recognized the envelope. She had bought it from a pharmacy drugstore in Billings, one of those cream-colored packs of 6 that cost $2. She recognized the way she'd written the address in the top left corner, her name followed by a P.O. box number she hadn't had access to in years. She recognized the stamp, slightly crooked, which was a habit she'd never broken. She had written this letter 7 years ago. She had given it to Thomas Garvin to mail on his way to Denver. Thomas was supposed to hand-deliver it, actually. She remembered now. He'd said mailing was unreliable. He would give it directly to... She heard footsteps in the main hall. She put the envelope back in the box. She stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind her and stood there with her heart going too fast and her hands not entirely steady. Damien Voss came around the corner at the end of the hall. He stopped. She was standing right outside the door she shouldn't have opened, and the door was closed now, but she was too close to it, and anyone who looked would know. He looked. His face changed. Not dramatically. Damien Voss's face didn't do dramatic. But something shifted in it, something that was not anger exactly, but was related to anger, and he said very quietly, "That door is kept closed." "I know," she said. "I was looking for the linen closet. I got the wrong one. I'm sorry." He held her gaze for a moment. She did not look away because looking away would have told him something she wasn't ready to tell him. She kept her eyes on his and waited. "It's the next one down," he said. "Thank you," she said. He walked past her. She watched him go to the end of the hall and turn the corner without looking back. She stood there and counted her own breathing until it settled. That night she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a letter she had written at 24, when she believed that if you put the right words in the right order and sent them to the right person, something would change. She thought about Thomas Garvin, who had promised to hand-deliver it, and who had then stopped returning her calls a week later. She had assumed he'd told the person, assumed the silence meant rejection, clean and final, the kind you don't argue with. She had never, in 6 years, considered another explanation. She thought about the envelope, sealed, unopened, in a box in a room on a ranch that belonged to a man she had met 4 days ago, a man who had nothing to do with any of this. She told herself there was probably an explanation that made sense. Coincidence, mistaken identity, something. She told herself that and almost believed it. She lasted 2 more days before she went back. Not to take anything, not to read anything she hadn't already seen, just to confirm what she had seen, because part of her had started to doubt her own memory. She had been tired when she found it, and her mind had been running on short sleep for weeks, and maybe she'd misread the handwriting. Maybe the name on the front was different from what she remembered. She went in the late afternoon when Damien was out on the north pasture with the fence crew and wouldn't be back until dark. She found the right moment, moved down the hallway, opened the door. The box was still on the desk. She didn't pick up the envelope. She just looked at it, looked at the handwriting on the front, the address, the name. She hadn't misremembered. The name on the front of that envelope was James Farrow, the man she had been in love with at 24, the man who had taken her letter, promised to deliver it, and then disappeared from her life without a word. James Farrow had died. She had found that out 3 months after the silence started, a mutual friend, haltingly, over the phone. A car accident outside Denver. She had not known how to process it. She had not known how to grieve someone she had been angry at for months. So she had done neither particularly well. She had just continued. The letter had never reached him. Obviously, it had gone somewhere else. Thomas Garvin must have had it, and when James died, and then somehow, eventually... She looked at the photograph on the shelf. She hadn't looked at it before. She looked at it now. 2 men. One of them was younger, early 30s maybe, and he had a face she didn't recognize. The other one... She stepped closer. The other one was James Farrow. The floor shifted. Not literally. But the room rearranged itself in her understanding, and she stood there holding the edge of the desk and looking at a photograph of a dead man standing next to someone who clearly knew him, and she thought, oh, that's what this is. She heard the truck outside, the sound of tires on gravel. She moved. She was back in the kitchen before anyone came through the front door, and she was at the stove with a spoon in her hand by the time she heard boots on the porch stairs. Her hands weren't shaking, she made sure of that. But her mind was not in the kitchen. Her mind was 6 years back, and it was asking questions she didn't have answers to yet. She needed to talk to Damien Voss. She just had no idea how. The storm that had been building for 2 days came down on a Saturday. It arrived in the night. Elena woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of it, the wind driving snow against the window in sheets. By the time she was in the kitchen at 5, the power had flickered twice, and the radio was saying 12 to 18 inches by evening, with a second band coming through after midnight. The kind of storm that didn't ask permission. She started the stove and started thinking. By noon, The roads were impassable. The hands who'd gone out at first light to check on the herd came back reporting drifts at the north fence that were already 4 feet high, and two of them had ice in their eyebrows and weren't finding it funny. Damien had been out with them and came in last, and she heard his voice in the hallway. Not angry, but clipped, the voice of someone making rapid calculations about problems that were stacking up faster than they could be resolved. Elena had a pot of soup going and biscuits in the oven, and a second pot heating for coffee that she intended to keep hot all day. She heard the hallway clear out as the hands went to the bunkhouse to get warm. Then footsteps. The deliberate kind. Damien came into the kitchen doorway. He was still in his coat, snow on his shoulders, and he looked at her with an expression that said he was too tired to manage his face properly. "How are supplies?" he said. "3 days comfortable," she said. 5 days if I stretch. Storm might keep us in for 4. "Then we're fine," she said. He stood there. She turned back to the stove and stirred the soup and waited because she could feel him deciding something. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She turned around. He looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been putting off for 2 weeks and has run out of reasons to keep putting off. His jaw was tight. His eyes were not soft. Damien Voss's eyes were never soft, but there was something in them she hadn't seen before. Something that looked like it cost him something. "The room at the end of the hall," he said. She didn't move. She didn't say anything. "I know you went back," he said. "I'm not angry. I just—" He stopped, looked at the floor, looked back at her. "I need to know if you recognized anything." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the storm pushed at the walls. "The photograph," she said. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then he opened them again. "James Farrow," he said. "Yes." "How did you know him?" She had been practicing this in her head for 2 days. The words were there, prepared, reasonable. She said them. "I was in love with him 6 years ago, before he died." The silence that followed was not a comfortable silence. It was the kind that happens when two people are both realizing, simultaneously, that they are in the same story from different angles. "The letter," she said. He didn't answer. "The envelope in the box," she said. "That's my handwriting. I wrote that letter to James. Thomas Garvin was supposed to deliver it." She heard her own voice, steady. She was keeping it steady. "James died before it reached him. I always assumed Thomas either lost it or—" She stopped. "How did you get it?" Damien was quiet for a long moment. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, not because he was comfortable, but because he needed something to do with his hands. He turned back to her. "James was my closest friend," he said. "Grew up together on this land. When he died, his family they weren't equipped to handle things. I handled things. I went to Denver, and I sorted through his belongings, and I brought home what mattered." He paused. The letter was in his coat, in the inside pocket, unopened. He'd had it for 2 days, and he hadn't opened it yet. I don't know why. Maybe he was waiting. Maybe he was nervous. Another pause. "I saw your name on the return address. The P.O. box. I tried to find you. That P.O. box was closed. She hadn't renewed it after she moved. Of course she hadn't." "I kept the letter," he said. "I don't know why exactly. It seemed wrong to throw it away. Like those were words that deserved to exist somewhere even if the person they were written to wasn't there anymore." Elena stood very still. 6 years of a story she thought she knew was rearranging itself in real time, and she was trying to stay upright inside it. "You kept it for 6 years," she said. "Yes." "You never opened it." "It wasn't mine to open." She looked at him. He was standing across the kitchen with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when he wasn't sure what to do next, which was to go very still and wait. And she thought, this is the man who protected a stranger's words for 6 years because he thought they deserved to be remembered. She didn't know what to do with that. Not yet. "I need a minute," she said. Take as long as you need," he said. He left the kitchen. She turned back to the stove and stood there with her hands on the edge of the counter, and the soup going and the biscuits in the oven and the storm pressing at every wall of the house. And she breathed. Outside, Montana kept coming down. She stayed in the kitchen for a long time after he left. The soup didn't need stirring, but she stirred it anyway, because her hands needed something to do while her mind did what it was going to do, regardless of whether she wanted it to. Outside, the storm had settled into a rhythm, not the violent gusting of the early hours, but a sustained pressure, the kind that meant it wasn't going anywhere for a while. The biscuits came out of the oven. She set them on the rack. She poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't drink. James Farrow had been 29 when he died. She had been 24 when she wrote him that letter. Those numbers felt strange now. Too young for everything that had happened. Too young for the weight she'd carried out of it. She had written the letter because she'd run out of nerve to say the things out loud. That was the truth of it, stripped of the stories she'd told herself over the years. She wasn't brave. She had put words on paper and handed them to a third person and called it courage. And then when the silence came, she had rebuilt the whole narrative. He read it, he chose silence, he chose someone else. She had misjudged everything. That story had kept her company for 6 years. It had told her who she was and what she'd lost and why she kept her distance from people now. It had also been completely wrong. She poured the coffee down the drain, poured a fresh cup, and went to find Damien Voss. He was in the main room, standing at the window watching the snow. He heard her come in, but didn't turn around immediately, which she was starting to understand was just how he operated. He needed a second before he could engage with something, like a man who'd trained himself to think before he moved. She sat down on the edge of the sofa. She didn't invite herself to sit, she just did it, because standing felt too formal for what she needed to say. "I need to ask you something," she said. He turned from the window. He didn't sit. He stood about 6 feet away with his arms at his sides and waited. "Thomas Garvin," she said. "Do you know who that is?" Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition of a name he'd filed somewhere and not expected to retrieve. "I know who he was," Damien said. She caught the past tense. Was. "He died about 4 years ago. Liver failure." He paused. "He worked here for a season, years back, before James died. Why?" "He was the one who was supposed to deliver the letter to James," she said, directly. "James was traveling, Thomas knew where he was going, and I gave it to Thomas to hand-deliver." Damien was quiet. "If Thomas had the letter," she said slowly, working it out as she went, "and James died, Thomas might have gone through his things before you got there. Might have found it, or James might have already had it, and Thomas—" She stopped. "I don't know. There are about 4 versions of how that letter ended up in James's coat pocket, and I can't tell which one is true." "It doesn't matter which one is true," Damien said. She looked at him. "The letter didn't reach him while he was alive," Damien said. "That's what matters. The rest is just the mechanics of how it got lost." He said it plainly, not cruelly, the way a practical man states a practical fact. But then something in his face shifted, went quieter. "He talked about you. James did. Not by name. He just said there was someone, that he was trying to figure out how to say some things." Elena sat with that for a moment. "When was this?" she asked. "A few weeks before he died," Damien said. "We were out fixing fence on the south pasture. He said, 'I'm going to Denver next week, and when I get back I'm going to stop being an idiot about something.' I asked him what. He said, 'A woman.' That's all he said." The fire in the main room hearth was burning low. Neither of them moved to add wood. "He wasn't an idiot," she said. "He was just—" She stopped. "We were both afraid of the same thing at the same time, and neither of us said so." "That's most people," Damien said. It wasn't a kind thing to say. It wasn't an unkind thing either. It was just true. And she appreciated the truth more in that moment than she would have appreciated comfort. She set her coffee cup on the table. "Thank you for keeping it." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know what else to do with it. Most people would have thrown it away. Most people aren't bothered by that kind of thing," he said. "I am." She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and stood up, because that felt like the end of something. Not the end of everything, just the end of this particular conversation, which had gone as far as it could go for now. She was turning to go back to the kitchen when he said it. "There's more." She stopped. "About the letter," he said. She turned back. He was looking at the floor, not in a defeated way. Damien Voss didn't do defeated, or at least he hadn't let her see it. More in the way a man looks at the floor when he's about to say something he would rather not have to say. I didn't just keep it because I couldn't find you, he said. I read your name on the return address, and I looked. He paused. I looked for you seriously. I hired someone to look. That P.O. box was closed, but your name was, it wasn't a common name. I got a few leads. One of them was a woman in Billings who ran a diner. I called. She said her daughter had moved away, didn't know where. He stopped again. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Elena stood very still. When was this? About a year after James died, he said. She did the math without wanting to. A year after James died, she had been in Denver herself, working a restaurant job and trying to put enough distance between herself and Billings to feel like a different person. Her mother hadn't known where she was. Not exactly. She'd been deliberate about that. If you'd found me, she said, what would you have done? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she was starting to understand was something he did. He didn't answer questions to fill space. He answered when he had an answer. Given you the letter, he said, told you about James, let you decide what to do with it. That's all? That's all? That's all, he said. She believed him. She wasn't sure why exactly. She had believed people before and been wrong, but she believed him now. Okay, she said. She went back to the kitchen. She put food on the table at noon. She did not cry, which she considered a reasonable achievement under the circumstances. The storm lasted 48 hours. In that time, the ranch became a closed system. No vehicles in or out, no deliveries, no contact from the outside world except the radio and what it chose to tell them. Elena had been in isolated situations before, but this was different. Here, the isolation had a population. 22 people with different appetites and tempers and ways of handling being stuck, and she was the person feeding them. It was, she realized by the second day, the most useful she'd felt in years. She organized the kitchen with the efficiency that came from necessity rather than preference. She parceled out the dry stores and adjusted the menu daily based on what would keep versus what needed to be used. She set up a coffee station in the bunkhouse hall so the hands could get their own without coming through the main house and tracking snow into her kitchen every 40 minutes. She made large batches of things that improved with sitting, a pot of beans that went 3 meals, a corn chowder that was better on day 2. And she used the downtime to clean and organize the pantry shelves, which had been stacked in a way that made inventory impossible. Pedro helped her carry things without being asked. He was the youngest on the ranch and the most willing, and she had started to appreciate his steadiness without making too much of it. He reminded her a little of herself at that age, capable and quiet and slightly unsure whether those qualities were enough. How long have you worked here? She asked him on the second afternoon. They were reorganizing the dry goods shelf, and he was passing her cans. 2 seasons, he said. Came up from Texas. My uncle worked here before me. Do you like it? He considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. It's a real place, he finally said. Some jobs aren't. This one is. She thought about that. What does that mean, a real place? Like it matters if you do your job right, he said. Like if you don't, you can see the difference. She put a can of tomatoes on the shelf. That's a good way to think about it. He passed her another can. Mr. Voss is hard to work for. She didn't ask him to elaborate. She waited. He's fair, Pedro said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words. He doesn't cheat anybody, but He stopped. He used to be different, before his friend died. A couple of the old hands said so, said he was easier to talk to. Now he just... Pedro shrugged. He runs things right. But it's like running things right is all there is. She stacked the cans. She didn't respond because she didn't have a response that was her right to give. But she filed it. She filed it next to the photograph on the shelf, and next to 2 days ago in the kitchen, and next to I didn't know what else to do with it. On the third morning, the storm broke. It went the way Montana storms go. Not gradually, not with any consideration for the people who'd been waiting it out. 1 hour it was still dark and heavy, and the wind was finding every gap in the weather stripping it could locate. The next hour the sky was clear and brutal and so blue it almost hurt, and the world outside was white in every direction and completely silent. The hands went out to assess damage. Elena stood on the kitchen porch for 3 minutes in the cold, not because she needed to, but because she needed to be outside for a minute, and the cold was clean in a way that felt like it cleared something. Greta found her there. "You'll freeze," she said. "I know," Elena said. She came back inside. Greta poured coffee for both of them without asking, and they stood at the kitchen counter, which was, Elena had noticed, where Greta was most comfortable. She was not a woman who did sitting. She worked or she stood. There wasn't much in between. "You talked to him," Greta said. Elena looked at her. "During the storm," Greta said. "I'm not asking what about. I'm just saying, I've worked here 7 years and that man does not talk to people he's just hired. Not like that." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I don't know what you said to him, but he came to breakfast yesterday and said good morning to Pedro. He hasn't done that in about 8 months. Elena didn't know what to say. "I didn't say anything special." "Clearly you did," Greta said. She looked out the window at the white landscape. "He's been running this place on fumes since James died. Not financially. The finances are a separate problem, but personally. Like he wound himself down to just the work and decided that was enough." "Is that why you hired me?" Elena asked. "Not just for the cooking." Greta's expression shifted, complicated. "I hired you because we needed a cook," she said. "Whatever else happens is not something I planned." It was an honest answer, which Elena respected, even if it wasn't a complete one. Well, the financial problem Greta had mentioned in passing became less abstract the following week. Elena heard it piece by piece, not because people were careless around her, but because kitchens are adjacent to everything, and everything passes through them eventually. A supplier had canceled a contract in November, citing a payment dispute that Damien had apparently contested and lost. A bank loan against the South pasture land was due for review in the spring, and the interest rate was going to adjust in a direction that wasn't going to be comfortable. 2 of the longer-term hands had left in the fall, and replacing them cost money that had gone somewhere else. The ranch was not failing. It was too solid, too established for that. But it was stressed in the way that things get stressed when multiple small problems compound. She thought about this while she was making bread. She did her best thinking while her hands were busy, and bread required a particular quality of attention, enough to keep the rhythm, but not so much that it crowded out everything else. She thought about what she'd seen in 2 weeks here, the way the supply budget was stretched thin, the way the morale in the bunkhouse rose and fell based on small things, a good meal, a bad day in the cold, whether Damien came to eat with them or not. The way Greta ran the household with total competence but no margin, like a woman who had learned not to account for error because error was too expensive. The bread went in the oven. She washed her hands. The supply situation was something she could actually do something about. She had been watching the waste in the kitchen, not obvious waste, but the kind that accrued in small amounts when nobody was tracking the whole picture. Half-used cans. Produce that went too long. Staples reordered before they were finished because the inventory was written on someone's mental list rather than a physical one. She spent an afternoon doing a proper inventory. Everything in the pantry, everything in the freezer, everything in the dry storage. She built a list in a notebook, pages of it, organized by category, with quantities and estimated days remaining. It took 4 hours. When she was done, she sat down and worked out what the kitchen actually needed versus what it had been ordering, and the difference was not small. She brought the notebook to Damien that evening. He was in the main room going through paperwork when she knocked on the doorframe. He looked up. She held out the notebook. "What is this?" he said. "Kitchen inventory," she said, "with a proposed order list for the next 6 weeks. I think we've been over-ordering on about 8 items and underutilizing what we have. If you adjust the order to what I've outlined, you'd save roughly $400 a month on kitchen supplies without any change in what I'm putting on the table." He looked at her. "I can walk you through it if you want," she said. He took the notebook. He opened it to the first page and looked at it, then flipped through several more pages with the attention of someone who was used to reading things carefully. He didn't speak for a while. When he looked up, his expression was different. Not warmer, exactly, but something had shifted in it. $400 a month, he said, give or take. I wasn't certain about current prices on a couple of items. How long did this take you? 4 hours, she said. I had time after the morning bread. He looked at the notebook again. This is more detailed than anything Greta's been given to work with. Greta's doing inventory for the whole household, Elena said. I'm just doing the kitchen. It's a smaller scope. Still, he said. He set the notebook on the table. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression of a man doing multiple calculations at once, Not just the money, but something else she couldn't entirely read. "What else have you noticed?" he said. She hesitated. Because she had noticed other things, and she hadn't been sure whether noticing them was her place. "I'll tell you if it's useful," he said. "Not as a criticism. Just tell me what you see." So she told him. The morale in the bunkhouse and what moved it. The way small things, coffee ready when the hands came in from the cold, a meal that was slightly better than expected, had more effect on the atmosphere than any single large gesture. The way Pedro moved through his work with a kind of care that suggested he was someone worth keeping. The way one of the older hands, a man named Curly, who'd been here 12 years, carried a resentment she hadn't been able to identify the source of. Damien listened without interrupting. When she stopped, he said, "Curly's been passed over for a foreman position twice. I haven't found a way to address it that doesn't create a different problem." "I didn't know that," she said, "but it explains the resentment." "What would you do?" She hadn't expected the question. She thought about it. "I don't know enough about the work to say." But ignored things don't stay quiet. They just get louder in a different register. He nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. She picked up the notebook from the table. "I'll leave you to it," she said. "Leave the notebook," he said. She set it back down and went to the kitchen. She stood there for a minute, not doing anything, just standing. The biscuits were done, the beans were simmering, everything was in its place. She felt for the first time since she'd arrived like she was in the right place. Not comfortable. Nothing about this situation was comfortable, but right. She was here, doing something real, and the complicated thing between her and Damien Voss and a dead man's letter was something she was going to have to figure out while standing right here in this kitchen, which was, it turned out, as good a place as any to figure out complicated things. 2 days later, Damien came to the kitchen at 7 in the evening. She was cleaning up from dinner. The hands had gone back to the bunkhouse. Greta was somewhere in the house doing whatever Greta did in her evenings, and the kitchen was quiet with the particular silence of a room recently full of people that is now empty. He came in without knocking. She wasn't sure he'd ever knocked, come to think of it, and sat down at the kitchen table. Not at the counter. At the actual table, which was a foretop near the window that the hands sometimes used when they came in early. He sat down like a man who didn't entirely mean to sit down, but ran out of reasons to stay standing. "You want coffee?" she said. "Sure," he said. She poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat down across from him, because standing while he sat would have felt performative, and she was past performing things. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He looked at it for a moment. "The bank meeting is in April," he said. She hadn't known the specific timeline. She just waited. "The loan restructure is going to require documentation I don't entirely have in order," he said. "Not because of anything dishonest, just—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "When James died, I was the one who handled everything on the ranch for about 6 months. The paperwork got behind. I've been catching up ever since, and I'm close, but close isn't the same as done." "Okay," she said. "I'm telling you because I might need to ask you to take on some things that aren't strictly cooking," he said. "If you're willing, organization tasks, inventories, not just kitchen. Greta is not—" He stopped again. "Greta is excellent at what she does, but she doesn't like paperwork and she's the first to say it." Elena looked at him. She thought about what this cost him. Not the asking, which was hard enough, but the implicit admission behind it. That things weren't in order. That he needed help. That admitting need was not something he'd been in the habit of doing for years. "I can help with that," she said. He nodded. He didn't say thank you. She was starting to understand that gratitude for Damien Voss came out sideways. In the way he looked at her when she said something that turned out to be right. In the coffee he'd accepted. In the fact that he was sitting at her kitchen table at 7 in the evening telling her something true. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up. "The ranch. Voss legacy. Did you always want it? Or is it—" She stopped because she wasn't sure how to finish the question without it sounding like criticism. "Or is it what I ended up with instead of what I wanted?" he said. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father built this place. My grandfather started it. I grew up understanding this was the thing I was going to be part of. Not a question, just a fact. And I'm good at it. I know how to run it." He paused. But there was about a 6-month period when I was 25 when I thought about leaving, going somewhere else. James was talking about it too. We were going to go somewhere, travel, see what else existed. What stopped you? My father got sick, he said simply. She nodded. James left eventually, Damien said. That was always his thing. He could go. I couldn't, not really. Not once it started being mine to carry. He looked at his coffee. I don't regret it. That's a different question. But do I always want it, the way you asked? Some days are different from others. It was the most he'd said about himself in one sitting, and she had the sense that he knew it and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. She didn't push further. They sat there for a while in a silence that had changed quality somewhere in the last 10 minutes, become something more like two people sharing space instead of two people conducting business. The snow outside the kitchen window had the blue-gray color of evening light on white, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was gone before either of them quite noticed. He stood up eventually, took his mug to the sink, rinsed it. She hadn't expected that, the rinsing, and she noticed it, and set it on the rack. Thanks for the coffee, he said. There's more if you want it in the morning, she said. He went out. She sat at the table for another minute before she stood up to finish the dishes. It wasn't that anything had changed. That would be too simple, too clean. What had changed was smaller than that. The gap had shifted slightly. The air between them had a different quality, and she was not yet sure what to do with that. She finished the dishes. She went to her room. She lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about a man who had kept a letter for 6 years because throwing it away felt wrong, who rinsed his coffee cup, who had wanted once to leave and hadn't, who sat at her kitchen table and said some days are different from others. Like that was the most he'd allow himself. She thought about James. Not the loss of him, she'd had 6 years to carry that, but the shape of him, the way he'd existed in her life. She had loved him the way you love someone when you're 24 and everything feels permanent. This was different. She wasn't 24. And whatever this was, it was nothing like permanent. It was uncertain and strange and layered over with grief that belonged to both of them, and she didn't have a name for it. But she thought about the rinse cup again, and something that had been tight in her chest for a long time shifted very slightly. Outside, Montana was cold and quiet. Inside the ranch house, the furnace ran. The letter sat in its box in its room at the end of the hall, still sealed, still carrying words that had been written a lifetime ago by a person she barely remembered being. She was not that person anymore. She didn't know yet what she was instead. But she was somewhere, doing something real, and for now that had to be enough. The notebook sat on Damien's desk for 3 days before he did anything with it. Elena knew this not because she was watching. She wasn't, or at least she was trying not to. But because she walked past the open office door twice a day, and she could see it there, sitting exactly where she'd left it, undisturbed. On the 4th day it was gone, and that evening at dinner Damien told Greta that the next supply order needed to be adjusted, and he read off numbers that matched Elena's list almost exactly. Greta looked at Elena across the kitchen. Elena looked at the stove. Nothing was said about it, but something had been decided. The thing about working in a closed system, a ranch in winter, everyone penned in by cold and distance, is that the small shifts between people become visible faster than they would anywhere else. There are no outside distractions to absorb the changes, no restaurants to go to, no errands to run, no casual encounters with strangers to reset the air between people. There's just the work and the meals and the long evenings and whatever exists between the people sharing them. What existed between Elena and Damien was not something either of them had named. It was cautious. It was aware of itself. It was the kind of thing that moves slowly, not because it's weak, but because both parties know, without saying so, that there are things underneath it that could break if handled wrong. She gave him the household inventory 2 weeks after the kitchen inventory. She had spent her evenings for 6 days going through the records Greta kept. And Greta did keep records, meticulous ones, just not in any format that allowed someone to see the whole picture at once. Elena spent those evenings reorganizing them, not replacing Greta's system, just creating a translation of it that could be handed to a bank. She put the folder on his desk on a Tuesday and left without explanation. He came to the kitchen that night, not at 7 this time, earlier, 6:30, when she was still cleaning up from dinner and Pedro was stacking chairs. "Pedro," Damien said. Pedro looked up. Go get some rest, Damien said. Not unkindly, but clearly. Pedro left without a word. He caught Elena's eye on his way out, and she gave him nothing to read, which he accepted with the equanimity of a young man who had learned not to need explanations. Damien stood in the kitchen doorway with the folder in his hand. He set it on the counter. Where did you get these numbers? Greta's files, Elena said. She had everything. It just needed to be consolidated. Greta doesn't know you did this. She knew I was working in the records room, Elena said. She didn't ask specifics and I didn't offer them. He looked at the folder again. He had the expression of a man reading something that is simultaneously a relief and an indictment. The relief of seeing things clearly and the discomfort of realizing how long they'd been unclear. The equipment maintenance log, he said. There are gaps in 2022. I know. I flagged them. She pointed to the yellow tabs she'd put on 3 pages. I don't know what happened during those months, but a bank examiner will notice. James died in March of 2022, Damien said quietly. She hadn't known the month. She absorbed it without showing that she had. The records pick up again in June, she said. If someone can fill in what happened during those months, even informal notes, anything that establishes continuity, it's better than silence. He opened the folder to the flagged pages. He stood there looking at them. She continued wiping down the counter, giving him the space to think without the pressure of being watched. I remember what happened during those months, he said. I just didn't write it down. Then write it down now, she said, dated retroactively with a note that it's reconstructed from memory. That's not falsification, it's documentation. Banks understand that people go through difficult periods. He looked at her. I'm not a lawyer, she said. Talk to your actual lawyer before you do anything. But that's my read. My lawyer costs $400 an hour, he said. Then make it count, she said. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. It was brief, and he didn't let it complete itself, but it was there. She filed it. Curly was a problem she had been circling for 3 weeks. She had noticed him from early on. He was impossible not to notice, because he had the particular quality of a man who has decided to be unnoticed and hasn't quite pulled it off. He was in his late 40s, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of mild skepticism. He had worked at Voss Legacy for 12 years, which made him the longest tenured hand on the ranch, and he moved through his work with the efficiency of someone who has done the same things long enough that they've become automatic. He was also, underneath all of that, furious. Not loudly, not in any way that spilled over into his work or his treatment of the other hands. But Elena had spent enough time in service work, in diners, in kitchens, in the particular economy of people who need something and can't say so directly, to recognize buried resentment. She knew the signs, the slight delay before responding to direction, the way he'd watched Damien from across the room with an expression that was carefully neutral and therefore revealed everything. She had not brought this up to Damien again after mentioning it once. She'd said her piece and left it alone. But the situation clarified itself in its own time. It was a Thursday morning, second week of February. She was bringing coffee out to the bunkhouse hallway. She did this occasionally now, not because it was expected, but because she had found that the 15 minutes after breakfast, when the hands were getting their gear together, was when the atmosphere of the day got set. And good coffee in those 15 minutes had an effect she could measure. When she heard voices from around the corner of the building, she didn't mean to hear. She stopped because she heard her own name. She's in everything now, Curly was saying. The voice was low, but not low enough. Kitchen, records room, his office. I've been here 12 years and I've never been in that office. Another voice, younger, someone she didn't immediately place. She's just helping with paperwork. She's repositioning herself, Curly said. Watch. By spring, she'll be making decisions that aren't hers to make. Elena stood around the corner of the building with a tray of coffee cups and thought, carefully and deliberately, about what to do. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't heard. That was the reasonable option. Instead, she walked around the corner. Curly saw her immediately. The younger hand, she recognized him now, a kid named Drew who had been here 4 months, went red. Curly's expression didn't change. He had good control of his face, she gave him that. Coffee, she said. She held out the tray. Neither of them moved for a second. Then Curly stepped forward and took a cup. Thanks, he said. His voice was level. Drew took one too and disappeared almost immediately with the particular speed of someone extracting himself from a situation. She stood there with Curly, just the two of them. He drank his coffee and looked at the middle distance, and she stood and did the same. 12 years is a long time, she said. It is, he said. You know this ranch better than anyone. He glanced at her, just briefly. I know parts of it. I'm not trying to reposition myself, she said. I'm a cook who can do paperwork. That's it. I'm not taking anything that's yours. He was quiet. He drank his coffee. She let the silence be what it was. What's yours? He finally said. And the way he said it was not hostile. It was a genuine question, the kind people ask when they're trying to figure out the map. Right now? A kitchen, she said. That's all. He nodded slowly, like he was filing something. He handed the cup back to the tray and walked away toward the barn. And she stood there in the cold with the tray and thought that it had gone about as well as it could have without any guarantee that it had actually resolved anything. She brought it up to Damien that afternoon. Not the conversation exactly, but the larger shape of it. She knocked on the office door frame. She always knocked now. She'd made that a rule for herself. And he looked up from the papers on his desk. Curly, she said. He set down his pen. He's got something he's been waiting to hear, she said. I don't know what it is. You do. But it's past time he heard it. Damien looked at her steadily. You talked to him. I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, and then I talked to him. Yes. What did he say? It doesn't matter what he said, she said. What matters is that you've got a man who's been here 12 years doing good work and feeling invisible. That's a waste. She paused. And I'm saying this because it's true, and because it's going to become a real problem if you don't address it, not because I have any stake in it. Damien was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen and set it down again. I know about Curly. Then do something about it. The words came out more bluntly than she'd intended. She heard them land. She watched his jaw tighten, not in anger, but in the way it tightened when something hit a nerve. I haven't found a solution that doesn't create a different problem, he said. Same thing he'd told her weeks ago. What's the different problem? She said. If I give Curly a foreman title, I've got 3 other men who've been here longer than the other 2 candidates, and the choice creates conflict in the wrong directions. What if you don't give him a title? Elena said. What if you just acknowledge, directly and specifically, what he's contributed and why it matters? Not in front of everyone, just man to man. He looked at her. You might be surprised, she said, how much of what looks like an ambition problem is actually a recognition problem. She left him with that. She went back to the kitchen and made the bread she'd been planning to make for 2 days, and she did not know what he did with what she'd said. But the following morning at breakfast, she watched Damien cross the bunkhouse yard and knock on the door of the small private room at the end of the bunkhouse where Curly slept. He went in. He was in there for about 20 minutes. When he came out, his expression was unreadable, which was normal. When Curly came out 20 minutes later to start his shift, he looked not happy exactly, not transformed, but he looked like a man who had been handed something he'd needed long enough that he'd stopped expecting it. Drew caught Elena's eye across the bunkhouse yard and gave her a look she couldn't entirely interpret. She turned back to the kitchen. The lawyer came in the 3rd week of February. His name was Aldrich, and he arrived in a truck that was considerably newer than anything on the ranch, and wore a coat that had not been selected for warmth. He was in his 50s with the careful posture of a man who had learned to make himself seem larger than his actual dimensions. And he shook Elena's hand in the kitchen doorway with the practiced warmth of someone who has learned that the domestic help often knows things the principals don't. She did not warm to him. She was not required to. He was there for 2 days, going through the folder she'd assembled with Damien and Damien's accountant, who joined via phone for 3 hours on the 2nd day, and whose voice she could hear through the office door at intervals. Greta served coffee and stayed away from the office. Elena cooked and stayed away from the office. Pedro went about his work with pointed normalcy. On the evening of the 2nd day, Aldrich came through the kitchen on his way to the front door. He paused. He looked at her with the assessing look she'd identified in the first 2 minutes as his primary mode of engagement with the world. You put together the household documentation? He said. Yes, she said. You work fast, he said. Not a compliment exactly, something between observation and question. I had good source material, she said. Greta's records were thorough. Damien said you reorganized them. Reorganized, not changed. She looked at him evenly. Everything in that folder is accurate. I know it is, he said. I checked. He picked up his coat from the chair where he'd draped it. The bank meeting in April should go better than it would have 6 weeks ago, for whatever that's worth from me. He left. She heard his truck on the gravel. She stood in the kitchen thinking about the thing he'd said. 6 weeks ago. Which was exactly how long she'd been here. She hadn't been counting, but he apparently had been. Damien found her in the records room the next morning. She had gone back to finish something she'd started before Aldrich arrived. A reconciliation of the equipment log, the gaps she'd flagged, which Damien had spent 4 evenings filling in with the careful handwriting of a man unaccustomed to written documentation but determined to do it right. She was cross-referencing his notes against the financial records to make sure the dates aligned. He leaned in the doorway. She heard him but didn't look up. Aldrich said the filing is in better shape than it's been in 3 years, he said. Aldrich talks more than I expected, she said. He does, Damien said. It's useful sometimes. He came into the room and sat down across from her, which was the chair that existed technically for guests, but had never, in her experience of this room, been used by anyone. I want to talk about your contract. She looked up. You were hired as a cook, he said, through March. That's 6 weeks from now. She put down her pen. I know. What you've been doing isn't what we hired you for, he said. And I haven't formally acknowledged that, which isn't right. He paused. I'd like to offer you a revised arrangement, year-round position, kitchen and administrative support, with appropriate pay for both. She looked at him. She was trying to read whether this was a business proposition or something else, and she was finding the distinction harder to locate than it should have been. I'd need to think about it, she said. He nodded. He seemed to have expected that. He stood up to leave and then stopped. He turned back. The letter, he said. She went still. I think you should have it, he said. You wrote it. It was meant to go to someone who can't receive it. It should come back to you. He paused. I'll put it in the records room. You can do whatever you want with it. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she could. There was a tightness in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not grief exactly. Not the kind she was used to, but something adjacent to it. He left. She sat in the records room alone and looked at the wall for a minute. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the numbers because the numbers were there and they needed doing, and sometimes the best way through a thing was just to keep working. The letter was on the desk in the records room when she came back after lunch. The cream-colored envelope, her own handwriting on the front, the name she hadn't spoken out loud in 6 years. She looked at it. She didn't touch it. She left it there and finished her work. At 4 o'clock, she picked it up. She held it for a moment. It was lighter than it felt, all things considered. And then she did the thing she hadn't known she needed to do until she was doing it. She slid her finger under the seal that James had never broken. She opened it. She read it standing in the records room in the late afternoon quiet of the ranch house. She had written it in one sitting, late at night, at the kitchen table of a small apartment she'd shared with 2 other women. She had written it because she'd run out of other ways to say what she meant. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, and she read it now with the particular distance of someone reading their own young handwriting. It was honest, uncomfortably so. It said things she hadn't let herself say out loud before or since. It said, I am afraid you don't feel what I feel. I am more afraid that you do, and neither of us is brave enough to say it plainly. It said, I'm not asking you to be sure. I'm just asking you to try. She stood there for a long time after she finished reading. The person who had written that letter had believed that honesty was enough, that if you said the true thing clearly enough, something would respond to it. She wasn't sure she still believed that. She wasn't sure she disbelieved it either. She folded the letter along its original creases. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the front pocket of her canvas duffel, where she would know where it was. Then she went to start dinner. March arrived with a thaw that lasted 4 days and then reversed. The ranch ran differently in the early spring almost thaw. There was hope in it that could turn ugly fast. Animals that needed moving, ground that looked passable and wasn't, equipment that had spent winter frozen and wasn't ready to perform. Elena watched Damien move through those days with a precision she had come to recognize, Not tense exactly, but coiled. Every decision made on partial information because partial information was all there was. She had not yet given him an answer about the contract. She knew he was waiting, and she knew he was not going to press, which was, perversely, one of the things that made her more inclined to say yes. She had spent enough time around people who pushed, who treated silence as an invitation to fill, who interpreted waiting as weakness. That a man who could hold space without crowding it was worth something to her. She was also afraid. She wasn't above admitting that, at least to herself. She had arrived here in December with $43 and an escape from something she hadn't examined closely enough to name. She had found, in 8 weeks, something that felt like ground under her feet. Saying yes to a permanent arrangement meant deciding that this ground was worth standing on. It also meant figuring out what she was standing on, exactly. She thought about this while she was in the storage barn one afternoon, looking for extra canning jars that Greta had mentioned might be there. The storage barn was on the north side of the property, away from the main buildings, and she had come out here alone with the justification of the canning jars and the real purpose of just needing 20 minutes outside the house. The barn smelled of old wood and hay, and the particular cold sweetness of a space that's been closed all winter. She found the canning jars on a shelf near the back, more than she needed, and she was doing a count when she heard the barn door open. She looked up. It wasn't Damien, it was Curly. He stopped when he saw her. He'd been carrying a piece of tack, a bridle, she thought, and he held it in both hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who hadn't expected the barn to be occupied. "Sorry," he said. "You're fine," she said. He came in the rest of the way and moved to the tack storage on the east wall. She continued counting jars. For a minute there was just the sound of him working with the bridle and her moving jars and the wind outside finding its way through the gaps in the siding. "That thing you said," he said, "about recognition." She looked over. He wasn't looking at her. He was working with the bridle, threading a buckle. "Damien talked to me," he said. "Said some things." He paused. "I've been working here 12 years and he's never said those particular things to me before." "What kind of things?" she asked. "The kind you don't say to a man unless you mean them," Curly said. He finally looked at her. "He said I was the reason this place held together after James died. Not exactly like that, but that's what he meant." She nodded. "I'm not saying you fixed anything," Curly said. "I'm saying whatever shifted, something shifted." "Things shift on their own eventually," she said. "Sometimes they need a hand," he said. He went back to the bridle. "You staying past March?" She looked at her jar count. "I haven't decided." "You should," he said. Just that. No elaboration, no explanation of why, no particular warmth in the delivery. He finished with the bridle, hung it on its hook, and left. She stood in the barn with 37 canning jars and thought about what it meant to be told, by a man who had resented her arrival, that she should stay. It didn't mean she was wanted, or it didn't mean only that. It meant she was useful, which was different. Useful was something she knew how to be. Wanted was something she was still figuring out. She carried 12 jars back to the house and left the rest. What? The thing that changed everything, or didn't change everything so much as make visible what had already changed, happened on a Wednesday night in mid-March. It was not a dramatic moment. That was almost the most surprising thing about it. She had been expecting drama, or braced for it at least, the way you brace when you're standing too close to a fire and you know it. What happened instead was quiet. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock, doing the March supply reconciliation, when she heard Damien in the hallway. Not footsteps. He'd stopped. She looked up, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway, not moving, holding a glass of water and looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She couldn't name it exactly. It was tired, but not the work tired she'd learned to recognize. It was the other kind, the kind that goes deeper than sleep can fix. "You look like something happened," she said. He came in and sat down. Not across the table, next to it, in the chair he sometimes used when he came in the evenings. He set the glass down and looked at it. "I found something today," he said, "in James's things, the stuff that's still in that room." She waited. "A letter he'd started writing," Damien said. "To you, never finished, maybe a paragraph." He looked up. "I don't know if you want to know what it said." Her pen was still in her hand. She set it down. "Was it—" She stopped, started again. Was it what I said in my letter? I think so, Damien said. I think he was trying to answer. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside something moved. An animal somewhere, a shift in the wind, and then it was quiet again. I was going to say it back, she said. I think so, Damien said. She looked at the table. 6 years of a story, and it kept gaining rooms, kept revealing doors she hadn't known were there. She had grieved James badly the first time. Not well, not fully, because she'd been grieving him wrong, grieving a rejection that hadn't happened. And then she'd come here and found the letter and grieved him differently, correctly, and thought she was done. And now there was an unfinished letter that meant the door between them had been open all along and she just hadn't known it. She realized her jaw was tight. She released it. Where is it? She asked. I left it in the room, he said. I wasn't sure if I should bring it to you or tell you first. Tell me first was right, she said. He nodded. They sat in the kitchen. She was not crying. She was not going to, at least not now, not here. She had a general policy about crying in front of people she didn't fully trust yet, and trust for her built slowly even when everything else was moving fast. I'm sorry, Damien said. Don't, she said. I'm not sorry for telling you, he said. I'm sorry it happened. All of it, the timing, the way it all went. It's not something to be sorry about, she said. Nobody did anything wrong. It's just how it went. That doesn't make it easier. No, she said. It doesn't. He was quiet. She was quiet. And in that quiet, something happened between them that she would have difficulty explaining later, to herself or anyone else. Not a gesture, not a word. Just the particular quality of two people sitting in the same grief, the same complicated absence, and not needing to explain it to each other because they were both already inside it. After a while, she picked up her pen. She went back to the supply reconciliation, because it needed doing, and because she needed the numbers to organize themselves under her hand. He stayed at the table. He didn't say anything. He drank his water. After 15 minutes, he got up and rinsed the glass and set it on the rack. He stopped in the doorway on his way out. He said, without turning around, "The contract offer stands. No pressure on timing." "I know," she said. He went down the hall. She heard his footsteps, and then the house was quiet. She sat for a long time after she finished the reconciliation, not doing anything, just sitting. The unfinished letter was in a room down the hall, in a box that had held 6 years of something she hadn't had a word for. She was going to go read it. Not tonight, but soon. And she was going to do whatever came after that, whatever that turned out to be. She thought about what Curly had said. You should stay. She thought about what Damien had said. No pressure on timing. She thought about what she had written at 24. I'm not asking you to be sure. I'm just asking you to try. She hadn't expected those words to find their way back to her. She hadn't expected any of this. The ranch, the storm, the box, the man in the kitchen doorway with a glass of water and a tired face. She hadn't expected to feel, for the first time in 6 years, like she was in the right place, even if the right place was strange and difficult and full of things she hadn't sorted out yet. She put the supply reconciliation in its folder. She turned off the kitchen light. She walked down the hall past the closed door of the room at the end, and she went to her own room, and she lay down on the narrow bed in the dark, and she did not sleep for a long time. But she was not unhappy. That was the thing that surprised her most. Under all the grief and the strangeness and the unsettled feeling of a life that had not yet resolved itself into its next shape, she was not unhappy. And that, she thought, was something to hold on to. She read James's unfinished letter on a Thursday morning when the house was empty. Damien had taken the hands out to the south pasture for a fence assessment that would run most of the day, and Greta had gone into Caldwell for supplies. The first real supply run in 3 weeks, the roads finally trustworthy enough to make it worthwhile. Elena had the ranch house to herself for the first time since December, and she stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes after everyone left, just listening to the quiet, before she walked down the hall. The room looked the same. Box on the desk, photograph on the shelf, the worn work gloves, the small hat. She had been in this room 3 times now, and each time it had given her something she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure what to expect this time. The unfinished letter was under the envelope she'd already taken back. A single folded sheet, plain paper, James's handwriting, which she recognized instantly, the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you loved, The particular slant and pressure of it imprinted somewhere below conscious memory. He had written a date at the top, 2 days before he died. She sat down in the chair at the desk and read it. It was, as Damien had said, about a paragraph, maybe 100 words. He had written her name at the top, not Dear Elena, just Elena, the way people write when they're not performing formality, when they're trying to say something real. He had written, I've been carrying your letter for 2 days without opening it because I was afraid of what it said and more afraid of what it didn't say. I think I know what's in it. I think I've known for a long time what I should have said to you and didn't, because I kept waiting for a moment that felt right, and I've come to understand that moment was never going to arrive on its own. And then it stopped, mid-sentence, mid-thought. The pen had trailed off in a small ink mark, the kind that happens when you set a pen down intending to come back. He hadn't come back. She sat there for a while with the letter in her hands. Outside, a bird moved through the bare trees near the window, and she tracked it without thinking about it, just watched it until it was gone. The room was cold the way it always was. It didn't get enough heat from the main furnace, and she could feel it in her hands. She had come here prepared to feel something specific. What she felt instead was more diffuse, harder to categorize. Not grief exactly, not anymore. Something more like completion. The closing of a loop she had not known was still open. He had known. He had been going to say it. The timing had been cruel and random, and nobody's fault and nobody's intention, and she had spent 6 years in the wreckage of something that had never actually fallen the way she thought it had. She folded the letter along its crease. She put it with the other one, in the front pocket of her duffel. Then she sat for another few minutes in the cold room, not because she needed to, but because it seemed like the right thing to do, to sit with it, not run from it. Then she got up and went to start lunch. She gave Damien her answer that evening. He came in from the south pasture later than expected, which meant dinner had been kept warm for 40 minutes, and the hands came in irritable and cold and smelling of mud and livestock, which was a combination that required a certain atmospheric management. She got them fed and the table cleared and the kitchen mostly restored before she registered that Damien hadn't come through yet. She found him on the porch. He was sitting in one of the wooden chairs that lined the front porch, still in his coat, looking out at the property in the last of the evening light. He had a cup of something, she couldn't tell what, in one hand, and he was not, as far as she could tell, doing anything at all, just sitting. She had rarely seen him not doing anything. It altered his appearance somehow, made him look both older and younger than she'd gotten used to. She pushed through the front door and stood next to the porch railing. The evening was cold but not brutal, the particular cold of early spring in Montana that carried the suggestion of something warmer without delivering it. "Dinner's inside," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll get it in a minute." She leaned against the railing. She looked out at what he was looking at, which was the pasture in the low light, the fence lines, the distant outline of the tree break on the north edge. It was not, objectively, a dramatic view. It was just the land. But she had started to understand after months here that the land meant something different when you'd grown up on it, when it was the fixed point around which everything else had organized itself. "I read it," she said. He didn't ask which one. He knew. "Okay," he said. "You were right that he was going to say it back," she said. He nodded. He drank whatever was in the cup. "I'm going to stay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not surprised. She didn't think she'd surprised him. But something shifted in his posture, something that had been held very slightly against the possibility of a different answer. "Year-round," she said. "Kitchen and administrative, whatever the arrangement looks like." "We can work out the specifics," he said. "Yes," she said. She pushed off the railing. She turned to go back inside, and then she stopped, because there was something else she needed to say, and she had been working up to it for 3 weeks, and she was tired of the build-up. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "I don't entirely know what this is," she said. "Between us. I'm not pretending I do, but I'm not going to keep pretending it's not something." He held her gaze. The evening light was doing something to his face that she couldn't entirely read. He said, "That's fair?" "That's all," she said. She went inside. She ate her own dinner at the kitchen table and thought that it was possible she had just done something either very wise or very inadvisable, and she wouldn't know which for a while, and that was, she supposed, true of most of the choices that actually mattered. April came, and with it, the bank meeting. Aldrich drove out the day before to go over the documentation one more time. He sat at the dining room table with the folder Elena had built, and a separate folder of his own, and a yellow legal pad on which he wrote things in handwriting that was nearly impossible to read, and Damien sat across from him and they went through it all again. Elena was not in the meeting. She was in the kitchen. But the dining room shared a wall with the kitchen and the door between them was not entirely soundproof, and she heard enough to understand the shape of it. The equipment maintenance gaps, now filled. The supplier contract dispute, which Aldrich had apparently found a way to document, is resolved. The loan restructure terms, which were going to be uncomfortable but not unsurvivable. At one point she heard Aldrich say, "The household documentation package is the strongest part of this presentation. Whoever put that together, it's thorough." She heard Damien's answer, which was too low for her to catch. She made coffee. She brought it to the dining room door, knocked, and set the tray on the sideboard inside without making it a thing. Aldrich looked up and said thank you in the way people say it when they've remembered that someone else is in the house. Damien looked at her over Aldrich's shoulder for one moment, not with anything she could name, just a look, and then went back to the legal pad. She went back to the kitchen. The bank meeting was in Caldwell, at a branch office that Damien had apparently been dealing with for 10 years. He drove himself. He left at 7 in the morning and came back at 2 in the afternoon, and Elena knew the moment she heard the truck on the gravel that it had gone reasonably well, because there was a particular quality to the way he drove when things had gone badly, something careful and controlled that she'd learned to recognize. And this was not that. He came through the kitchen door, not the front door, which he sometimes did when he didn't want the whole house to register his return. He set his keys on the counter. He looked at Elena, who was at the stove making the soup she'd started that morning. "They approved the restructure," he said. "Good," she said. "The rate is still not ideal," he said. "But manageable?" "Manageable," he said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked around the kitchen in the way a man looks at a room he's just realized he's glad to be back in. "Aldrich said to tell you the documentation package was what made the difference." "Aldrich talks a lot," she said. "He does," Damien said. He pulled out the kitchen chair. His chair, she had started to think of it that way, though she hadn't said so, and sat down. "But he's not wrong." She brought him a cup of coffee without being asked, because it was 2 o'clock and he'd been in a bank meeting for 7 hours, and that seemed like a situation that called for coffee. He took it. He did not say thank you in words, but he wrapped both hands around it the way he did when something had cost him, and she understood. "The supplier situation," she said, "the one that got dropped in November. Is that something that can be repaired, or do you need to find someone new?" He looked at her over the cup. "Why?" "Because I've been looking at the supply chain for the kitchen, and there are 2 vendors we're overpaying for dry goods. If you're going to renegotiate contracts anyway, it might be worth doing the whole inventory at once." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have names?" "I have 3 options," she said. "I've been comparing prices for 6 weeks." She got the notebook from the shelf by the stove. She kept working notebooks on that shelf now, alongside the cookbooks, and nobody had said anything about it. She opened it to the page she wanted and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He was quiet for long enough that she went back to the stove. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. 6 weeks, she said. "I said that. I mean, in general. How long have you been the person who does this?" She thought about it. "Since I was 10, she said. "My mother's diner was always on the edge of something. I learned to watch the numbers because nobody else was." He closed the notebook. He didn't push it back to her, which meant he was going to do something with it. "Your mother, is she still in Billings?" She stirred the soup. "She died 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," he said. "It was after a long illness," she said. She was ready. She paused. She would have liked this place. She liked things that made sense, things where the work was connected to something real. "Pedro said something like that," Damien said, "when he first got here." "Pedro's smart," she said. "He is." He drank his coffee. "I've been thinking about what you said, about making decisions that create other problems. With Curly." He paused. "I think I've been using that logic to avoid decisions in general, not just with Curly." She didn't respond to that. It wasn't a statement that wanted a response. "The ranch has been running on inertia since James died," he said. I've been maintaining, not building. And I've been telling myself that's the responsible thing, given the financial situation, but I think some of it is just... He stopped. Easier, she said. Yeah, he said quietly. Easier. She turned from the stove. He was looking at the table, not at her, and she could see the effort of the admission in the set of his shoulders. Not embarrassment exactly, but the particular effort of saying a true thing about yourself that you haven't let yourself say before. What would building look like? She asked. He looked up. What do you mean? If you were building instead of maintaining, she said, what would be different? He thought about it. Genuinely, the way he always thought about things before he answered. The cattle operation could be expanded. There's a market for grass-fed beef that we're not in right now. It requires a certification process and about 18 months of adjustment, but the margins are better. The south pasture could support twice the headcount it's carrying. And there's a piece of land on the east boundary that's been empty for 3 years. The family that owned it left, and they've been paying property taxes on nothing. I've thought about approaching them. Why haven't you? Takes capital I haven't had. The loan restructure frees up some capital, she said. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I think about things, she said, while I'm cooking. He almost smiled. There it was again. That almost, the thing that didn't quite complete itself and was somehow more expressive for it. I've noticed that, he said. She turned the soup down to simmer. Talk to Curly about the cattle expansion, she said. He knows the pasture capacity, and he'll be better at it than he's been at whatever he's been doing with the resentment. I know, Damien said. He stood up. He took his cup to the sink and rinsed it. She had stopped noticing this habit, and then had noticed that she'd stopped noticing it, which was its own kind of information. I'll set up a time. He left the kitchen. She heard him go down the hall, and then the sound of the office door, and then the house settled back into its regular afternoon rhythm. She stood at the stove and thought about 18 months of adjustment and grass-fed certification and a piece of land on the east boundary and a man who had been maintaining instead of building and had just for the first time said so out loud. She thought the soup needed more salt. She added some. She tasted it again. Better. The east boundary situation arrived faster than anyone expected. She found out about it not from Damien, but from Greta, who had a network of information that operated through channels. Elena had not been able to fully map, but which seemed to involve the woman who ran the post office in Caldwell and possibly the man who serviced the propane systems in the county. Henderson family is selling, Greta said. She was at the kitchen counter folding dish towels, which was the task she gravitated toward when she wanted to say something and needed her hands occupied. All 300 acres. They've got a buyer, some developer out of Bozeman who wants to put cabins on it. Elena set down her knife. Cabins. Vacation rental operation, Greta said, which would mean access roads and construction traffic on the north side of the Henderson land, which shares a border with our east pasture. When did this happen? Offer was made last week. Henderson's grandson let it slip at the gas station in Caldwell. Greta's cousin heard it. Greta stacked the towels with particular precision. Damien doesn't know yet. Elena picked up her knife again. She thought for a moment. Why are you telling me before him? Greta looked at her with the expression of a woman who has decided something and is now waiting for the other person to catch up. Because you'll think about how to tell him, she said. And I won't. It was, as Elena thought, a strangely honest thing to say. She absorbed it. When is the offer good through? 2 weeks, I think. Maybe less. She told Damien that evening. She did not dramatize it. She just stated it plainly, what Greta had told her while he was reading at the desk in the main room. She watched his face while he processed it. He went very still in the way he went still when he was doing rapid calculation. If a vacation operation goes in on that land, he said slowly, we lose the east pasture as functional grazing space. The noise alone. I know, she said. The Hendersons, he said. I know that family. I should have approached them last year. You had other things, she said. I should have... He stopped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back down, and she saw him let go of the retrospective, which was, she had observed, something he was getting incrementally better at. What's the price on that land? I don't know, she said. I only know what Greta told me. You'd need to call. I don't have the capital for a full purchase, he said. Not right now. Not after the loan restructure. What about a partnership? She said. He looked at her. If there's another rancher in the county who has the same concern about the east boundary development, someone whose operation would also be affected, it might be worth a conversation, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Mercer, he said. It sounded like a name he'd been avoiding saying for reasons she didn't know yet. Who's Mercer? Ranch about 40 miles northeast, he said. Gerald Mercer. He and my father had a property dispute about 20 years ago that technically resolved but didn't, in the way these things don't. He paused. His east pasture has the same exposure problem. If vacation traffic goes into the Henderson land, it affects him too. So call him, she said. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You make things sound simple. They're not simple, she said. I just don't think they're as complicated as not doing them. He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up the phone. She left the main room and gave him the space to make the call in private. She went to the kitchen and washed dishes that were already clean because she needed something for her hands. And she listened to the distant sound of his voice through the wall. Not the words, just the cadence of it, the way it shifted over the course of 20 minutes from the careful formality of a man calling someone he's been in conflict with to something that sounded, by the end, more like two ranchers talking about a problem they shared. He came to the kitchen afterward. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and said, Mercer's interested. Good, she said. He said he'd wondered when someone from Voss was going to call, Damien said. There was something dry in his voice. Said he'd been waiting for 6 months. People usually are, she said. He nodded. He looked at the clean dishes on the rack. You washed all of those twice, he said. She looked at the rack. He was right. I know, she said. Something shifted in his face, not the almost smile, something different, something that had more weight to it. He said, Elena. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, for all of it. The records, the supplies, the conversation about Curly, this. He paused. I'm not good at saying it, and I've been letting that be an excuse, but it matters. What you've done here matters. She looked at him steadily. The kitchen was warm and the evening was outside the window and everything was very ordinary in the way that important moments usually are. I know, she said, and you're welcome. He nodded. He turned to leave and she said, Damien. He stopped. It goes both ways, she said. He turned back. There was a question in his face. I came here with $43 in a duffel bag, she said. I was in the process of running away from something I hadn't looked at clearly in years. I needed... She stopped. She started again. I needed a place to be useful while I figured out the rest. You gave me that. Whether or not you meant to. He held her gaze. Whatever the expression was on his face now, she didn't have a word for it. It wasn't simple enough for one word. I meant to, he said quietly. When I offered you the year-round contract, the rest of it, I didn't plan. Neither did I, she said. They stood in the kitchen doorway in the particular way of two people who are on one side of something and can see the other side from where they're standing, but have not yet moved toward it. Not because they were afraid exactly, or not only because of that, but because some distances need to be crossed carefully, especially when what's on both sides is something that matters. She broke the moment first because one of them had to. She turned back to the sink. Mercer, is he someone you can actually work with, or is the history going to make it complicated? It'll be complicated, Damien said. She could hear in his voice that he'd accepted the change of subject, that he understood why she'd made it, and that he was not going to push. His father and my father had a dispute about water rights that got personal. Gerald and I are not our fathers. But it'll take some navigating. You're good at navigating, she said. I'm better at it than I used to be, he said. She heard what he meant by that. She kept her eyes on the sink. Well, the Mercer meeting happened at the Voss Ranch on a Friday, because Damien had made the call and Damien had the larger operation, and the unspoken protocol of these things put the meeting on his ground. Elena made lunch for 4. Damien, Gerald Mercer, Mercer's son, who came along and said almost nothing, and Aldrich, who Damien had asked to be present because the conversation was likely to move from the conceptual to the contractual faster than either of them anticipated. Gerald Mercer was in his late 60s, a thick-necked man with the careful handshake of someone who'd been in negotiations before and knew better than to show his hand in the greeting. He looked at Elena when Damien introduced her. My ranch manager and administrative coordinator was the phrase Damien used, which was not a title they had explicitly agreed on, but which felt accurate enough that she didn't correct it. And Mercer's look was the assessing kind, the kind that was doing math. You put together the documentation Aldrich mentioned? Mercer said. Yes, she said. Thorough, he said. It was what Aldrich had said too. She was starting to think it was the word men in that county used when they meant something more than the word itself. Thank you, she said. Lunch is at noon. She went back to the kitchen and let them talk. The meeting went 3 hours. She could hear the rises and falls of it through the shared wall, the moments of tension, the moments of alignment, the particular silence that fell when Aldrich was reading something to both of them. She had lunch ready at noon and they took a break to eat, and at the table the conversation was different, looser, the careful formality slightly dissolved by food, and the fact of being in a kitchen instead of a meeting room. Mercer's son, whose name was Cal, and who was about 30, finally spoke at lunch. He looked at the soup Elena had made, a white bean and smoked ham soup that had been going since morning, and said, "This is what my grandmother used to make." "Good memory, then," Elena said. He smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from either of the Mercers. "Yeah," he said. Gerald Mercer watched this exchange. He looked at Elena and then at Damien, and something behind his eyes recalibrated slightly, the way a man recalibrates when he's revised an assumption. After lunch, they went back to the main room. Elena cleaned up and listened. By 2 o'clock, she heard something that sounded like agreement. Not final, not signed, but the kind of agreement that meant both parties had found enough common ground to keep going. By 3 o'clock, the Mercers were getting their coats. Aldrich stayed for another hour. When he left, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. He always stopped in the kitchen doorway, she had noticed, which meant he was more comfortable with her than he let on, and said, "Joint purchase offer goes to Henderson by end of week. If Henderson takes it, you're looking at shared ownership of 300 acres with a man your family hasn't spoken to in 20 years. "I know," she said. "That's either very good or very complicated," he said. "Probably both," she said. He almost smiled, the first time she'd seen that from him, and he left. Damien came to the kitchen an hour after that. The house had emptied out, and it was just the two of them and the late afternoon, and she was at the stove because dinner needed to happen regardless of what else had happened. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He sat down in his chair. He looked like a man who had run a long race and was still processing whether he'd won or just finished. Mercer said, at the end, he said, that his father would have been sorry about the water rights dispute, that he'd said so before he died. She turned from the stove. "That's something." "It is," Damien said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father never said anything like that about it. I don't know if he was sorry or not." He paused. "I've been carrying that dispute like it was mine, like I inherited the obligation along with the land." "You don't have to," she said. "I know that now," he said, "more than I did this morning." She went back to the stove. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing the thing it did in March and April, coming in low and long and giving everything a temporary gold quality that didn't survive into evening. She watched it move across the kitchen floor. "Gerald Mercer looked at you at lunch," Damien said, "when Cal said the thing about his grandmother's soup." "I noticed," she said. "He recalibrated something," Damien said. "I could see it." "People do that," she said, "when they realize the room is different from what they assumed." "You do that to people," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation, said in the flat way he said things that he meant. She thought about that. "I just cooked the food," she said. "No," he said. "You don't just cook the food. I think you know that." She did know it. She had always known it. She just wasn't in the habit of saying so, because saying so had, in her experience, a tendency to make people uncomfortable. But Damien Voss was not, she had found, a man made uncomfortable by true things. "I pay attention," she said. "That's all it is. I pay attention to what a room needs and I try to provide it." "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." The light moved across the floor and reached the far wall, and then the sun dropped enough that it was gone, and the kitchen went back to its regular evening self, warm from the stove, ordinary, functional. She put the pot on the back burner and started on the bread, because there was always tomorrow's bread to start. She was working the dough when Damien said, "I'd like to show you something tomorrow, if you're not too busy in the morning." She kept working the dough. "What is it?" "The south pasture," he said, "where I'm thinking the expansion would go. I want—" He stopped. "I want to know what you think about it." She had never been to the south pasture. She had been on the ranch for 4 months and had not left the immediate property. The house, the barns, the bunkhouse, the storage buildings. The world had been small and specific, and she had not minded that. But she thought about the south pasture in the morning light, and Damien wanting to know what she thought about it, and something moved in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He stayed in the kitchen until dinner was ready, reading something he'd brought from the office, and she cooked around him in the way she'd gotten used to, the two of them occupying the same space without negotiating it, each doing what they needed to do, the kitchen holding both of them without trouble. That was something, she thought, that easiness. It wasn't nothing. The south pasture in the morning was a different world from the ranch house. Elena had not understood, until she stood in it, how large the Voss operation actually was. From the kitchen window, the property looked contained. Buildings, fence lines, the tree break on the north edge. But the south pasture opened out beyond the last barn and kept going, wide and brown gold in the early April light, the ground still firm from winter, but with the first suggestions of green coming up at the roots of the dry grass. The fence lines ran until they disappeared. The sky above it was immense. Damien stood beside her without talking. He had a habit of letting things be what they were without narrating them, which she had come to appreciate more than almost anything else about him. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and let her look. "How many acres?" she asked. "South pasture alone is 800, he said. "We're running about 300 head on it right now. Capacity is closer to 600 if the grass management is right." She looked at the fence lines. "That's a lot of infrastructure change." "Yes," he said. "And the certification? 18 months, you said. Minimum. There's a program through the state that provides technical support. It's not easy, but it's not impossible." He paused. "I've been sitting on the application for 8 months. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because applying meant committing," he said. "And committing meant this was the direction we were going, and if it failed—" He stopped. He looked at the pasture. "James was the one who found the program. He brought me the paperwork. Said it was the future of the operation. That was 6 months before he died." He paused. "After he died, I couldn't look at the paperwork for a long time. And then looking at it was it was hard in a way I couldn't explain to anyone." She stood beside him and looked at 800 acres of ground that had been waiting for something for 3 years because grief had made the paperwork unbearable. She thought there was something almost unbearably human about that. Not weak, just human. The way loss attaches itself to objects and decisions and pieces of paper until even the practical things become weight. "Submit the application," she said. He looked at her. "James found the program," she said. "He thought it was right. He was probably correct. Submit the application." He held her gaze for a moment. She didn't look away. She had gotten better at not looking away. "Okay," he said. They stood there a while longer. The morning light moved across the pasture in the way it does in open country, in broad, slow sweeps, and a hawk crossed somewhere high above them, without apparent urgency. The cold was real but not punishing. It was the kind of morning that made you understand why someone would choose this place, why someone would structure an entire life around it. "James was right," she said. "It is the future of the operation." Damien was quiet for a moment. "You never met him?" "No," she said. "But I know what he thought. I know how he wrote. And I know what you've built here, which tells me something about the people who built it with you." He didn't respond to that, but something in his face, in the way he was standing, changed slightly. Not dramatically, just slightly. They walked back to the ranch house for breakfast, and neither of them said much on the way, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that she had stopped taking for granted because she had lived enough of her life in the other kind to know the difference. Henderson accepted the joint offer in the second week of April. Aldrich called with the news on a Tuesday morning, and Damien came to the kitchen to tell Elena with the particular expression of a man who has been braced for bad news long enough that good news lands slightly wrong. Like he didn't entirely trust it. Henderson signed, he said. She was making biscuits. She set down the cutter. All 300 acres? All of it, he said. 50-50 with Mercer. Closing is in 6 weeks. She looked at him. That's good news. I know, he said. He leaned against the counter. Gerald Mercer called right after Aldrich. He wants to put in a shared fence line on the boundary. Wants to start the conversation about long-term management. He paused. He said to tell you the soup was the best he'd had since his mother died. Elena turned back to the biscuits. She pressed the cutter into the dough and tried not to smile, because the thing about Mercer's soup comment was that it was both about the soup and not about the soup at all, and she had understood that at the time and was glad Mercer apparently had also. The Voss-Mercer fence line, she said. Your fathers would have something to say about that. Probably, Damien said, but they're not here to say it. She put the biscuits in the oven. She turned around and looked at him, really looked, in the way she'd gotten more willing to do over these months. Not the quick professional assessment she'd used in December, but the actual thing, the taking in of a person. He was different from the man who had come into the kitchen doorway in early December and looked at her like equipment. Not a different person. The same one, with some of the load redistributed. You should tell Curly first, she said. Before the general announcement. He's going to be the one who manages the expansion. He should hear it from you directly. I know, he said. I'm doing it this afternoon. Good, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Elena. She waited. When we close on the Henderson land, he said, I'd like to name it, the joint parcel. He paused. I'd like to call it Faro Pasture. She stood very still. It was his idea, Damien said. The expansion, the grass-fed program, the application, all of it. It started with James. It seems like the right thing. He said it carefully, watching her face. If you think that's wrong, or too much, tell me. She thought about a man who had been dead for 6 years, and who had, in those 6 years, managed to shape the direction of a ranch he'd never owned, the decision of a man he'd loved like a brother, and the path of a woman he'd been going to say something important to. She thought about unfinished letters and sealed envelopes, and the particular way that some things outlast the people who started them. It's right, she said. It's exactly right. Damien nodded. He looked at the oven where the biscuits were baking. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Curly cried. Elena found this out not from Damien and not from Curly himself, but from Pedro, who had been near the south barn when Damien pulled Curly aside for the conversation about the expansion and the foreman role. Because the role came with the announcement, attached to it the way Damien had apparently decided it needed to be, the thing he should have said a year ago said now, with the expansion as the frame. I didn't hear what they said, Pedro told her, leaning in the kitchen doorway that evening. But I saw Curly's face after. He turned away before he thought anyone was looking. He paused. I looked away too. Good, she said. Mr. Voss shook his hand, Pedro said. Like a real handshake, not the work kind. She nodded. She went back to the stove. He's been different, Pedro said. Curly? Mr. Voss, Pedro said. Since you got here. He said it plainly, without accusation or suggestion, just as a statement of what he had observed. Not like a different person, like the same person with more room in him. She thought about that phrase, more room in him, and thought it was probably the most accurate description she'd heard. Not changed, just expanded. The way a house that's been closed all winter opens up when the windows finally go up in spring. He was always like that, she said. He just needed some things to shift. Pedro considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. Did you shift them? Some of it, she said. Some of it was just time. He nodded, accepting this, and went back to his work. The grass-fed certification application went in the last week of April. Damien drove it to the state agricultural office himself rather than mailing it, which Elena thought probably said something about how much it had cost him to fill it out, the wanting to be certain it arrived. He came back that afternoon and told her matter-of-factly, the way he told her most things, and she said good, and they had dinner, and that was that. Except that night she found him in the main room, not reading, not doing paperwork, just sitting. The fire was going, and he had a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, and he was looking at something she couldn't see. She had gotten past the point of pretending she hadn't noticed things. She came in and sat in the chair across from him. How long did it take you to fill it out? She asked. 3 evenings, he said. There's a section where you describe your operation's history, why you're applying, what the program means to your long-term vision. He paused. I had to write about James, about where the idea started. She nodded. I hadn't written his name on anything official in 3 years, he said. I'd been careful about that without knowing I was being careful about it. He drank from the glass. Writing it down felt different, like it was real in a different way. It is real, she said. That's not a bad thing. I know, he said. It just took me by surprise. They sat with fire for a while. It was the kind of evening that had become familiar over 5 months. Not planned, not arranged, just the two of them in the same room at the end of a day, talking about the real things because they had run out of reasons not to. She had stopped being surprised by how natural it felt. She had started cautiously to let herself expect it. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked at her. The day I arrived, she said, when you came into the kitchen and looked at my supply list, you were very clear that I was there to work. Nothing more. She paused. Was that for your benefit or mine? He was quiet for a moment. Mine, he said. Entirely mine. Why? He held the glass in both hands and looked at it. Because you were... I noticed you immediately. In a way I hadn't noticed anyone in a long time, and I didn't know what to do with that. He looked up. I also didn't know yet that you had any connection to James. That came later. But at the beginning it was just... He paused. I didn't trust my own judgment about people. I hadn't, since he died. Why him? She asked. Why did losing him make you distrust your judgment about people? He thought about it. Because I'd trusted mine about him completely, he said. He was my closest friend for 30 years. I thought I knew him, all of him. And then he died, and I realized there were things about his life, his interior life, that I hadn't known. The woman he hadn't told me about. The things he was working up to say. He'd been carrying things alone that he didn't share with me, and I hadn't known to ask. He paused. If I'd missed that about him, I figured I was probably missing things about everyone. Elena looked at the fire. She thought about the cost of that, of deciding that grief meant you couldn't trust your own perception. She understood it. She had done her own version of it for 6 years, deciding that the silence from James meant she had fundamentally misjudged what was between them, and therefore what she felt couldn't be trusted, and therefore she should feel less. We both did the same thing, she said. He looked at her. Use the loss to argue against ourselves, she said. You decided you couldn't trust your perception. I decided I couldn't trust what I felt. Different conclusions, same logic. She paused. Wrong logic. He was quiet for a long moment. Yeah, he said. The fire crackled. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it did, cold and vast and indifferent. And inside the main room of the Voss ranch house, 2 people sat across from each other and looked at a fire and were, for the first time in a long time, not arguing against themselves. What do you feel? He said. He said it carefully, not with challenge in it. With something that was more like the question itself was an act of courage, the way asking a true question always is. She looked at him. She had been circling this for 5 months. She had earned the right to the answer. Like, this is the right place, she said, and you're part of why. He held her gaze. That's not nothing, he said. No, she said. It's not nothing. He set the glass down on the side table. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her with the expression she'd never been able to name, the one that had more weight in it than the almost smile, that carried more of him. I'm not good at this, he said. The saying it. You've probably noticed. I've noticed, she said. I'm working on it, he said. I know, she said. I can tell. He almost smiled. It completed itself this time. Not fully, not the uncomplicated smile of someone without history, but a real one, with the texture of a man who had learned to carry difficult things and had recently, slowly, started setting some of them down. She smiled back. She let herself. The Henderson land closed in late May. The signing happened at Aldrich's office in Caldwell, Damien and Gerald Mercer, across a table from each other for the second time in 6 weeks, which was more contact between the Voss and Mercer operations than there had been in 20 years. Cal Mercer came again and sat in the corner and said very little, the same as before. Aldrich notarized things. Elena was not there. She was at the ranch making lunch, which was where she was supposed to be, and she would not have changed that. What happened at the table was Damien's to handle, and he was fully capable of handling it, which was something she had never doubted, only something she'd helped him remember about himself. He called her from Aldrich's parking lot after. "It's done," he said. "Good," she said. "Come home. Lunch is ready." A brief silence. She realized what she'd said, "Come home," and did not walk it back because walking it back would have made it a thing when it was just true. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said. He was there in 35. She didn't comment on the time. The summer changed the ranch in ways Elena had not entirely anticipated. She had known it intellectually, more headcount, more infrastructure, more labor, more moving parts. But the actual texture of a growing operation was different from the concept of one. The south pasture filled up. Curly moved through his expanded role with the particular satisfaction of a man who has finally been given the work he was made for, which showed in how he carried himself and in how the other hands responded to him. The resentment was gone. She couldn't say exactly when it had left, only that one morning she noticed it wasn't there anymore, the way you notice an absence you've stopped expecting to be filled. Pedro got more responsibility too. Not a formal title, just more scope. Damien began consulting him on the logistics of the expansion in a way that was practical, but also deliberate, the way you bring someone along when you've decided they're worth bringing. Elena had watched this happen and had not said anything about it, because she'd said her piece about Pedro months ago, and the rest was Damien's to act on in his own time. The Mercer collaboration, which she had expected to be the complicated part, turned out to be less complicated than anyone anticipated. Gerald Mercer was, beneath the careful handshake and the history, a pragmatic man who understood that the dispute between their fathers had cost both families more than it had protected, and he was old enough to be done paying that cost. He and Damien were not friends. That would have been too much to expect, too fast. But they were two people who had found it possible to work together, which was, in Elena's experience, often more durable than friendship. Cal Mercer turned out to have opinions about cattle genetics that Curly found interesting enough to argue with, which led to 3 conversations over the summer that resulted in something resembling a friendship between the two of them, which nobody had predicted, and which made Damien and Gerald look at each other across a fence line one afternoon with the slightly helpless expression of men whose operations had entangled more thoroughly than planned. Elena watched all of this from the kitchen and from the records room and from the south pasture fence line when she walked out in the mornings, and she thought about the particular way that things connect when you stop managing them so tightly. How life has a tendency, given the smallest opening, to move towards something. She was not the same person who had arrived in December with $43. She knew that. The canvas duffel was still in her room, still patched at the corner with electrical tape, because some things you keep not out of need, but out of honesty about where you came from. But the person who had packed it in a state of quiet desperation, who had taken a job she knew nothing about in a place she'd never been because staying where she was felt like suffocating, that person had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Not rescue. She was clear about that. Nobody had rescued her. Damien had given her a job and she'd done it well, and the rest of what had developed was the result of 2 people paying attention to what was real and not running from it. That distinction mattered to her. She was $43 and a duffel bag. She was also the person who had rebuilt the supply chain, reorganized the records, named the new pasture after the right man, and told a rancher with walls around him that what was between them wasn't nothing. Both of those things were true at the same time. Whoa. She opened the room at the end of the hall in August. Not dramatically, not with announcement. She just stopped one morning on her way past and opened the door and stood in the doorway. And the room was the same. Desk, box, shelves, the worn gloves, the small hat, the photograph. She had been past this door 100 times since March, and she had not gone in. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she was waiting until it felt like the right time, and she had learned to trust that feeling when it came. She crossed to the shelf and looked at the photograph. The 2 men, James and Damien, young in the way that people are young when they don't know yet what's coming. James was laughing at something outside the frame. Damien was looking at him with the expression of someone who was used to being the observer in the room, who found his pleasure in watching things rather than performing them. She recognized the expression. She saw it every day. She picked up the photograph. She carried it out of the room and down the hall and into the main room, where she set it on the mantel above the fireplace. Not prominently, not in the center, just there, where it could be seen. Damien came in that evening and stopped when he saw it. She was in the chair by the window. She watched him look at it. He stood there for a long moment without saying anything. She didn't say anything either. She let him have the looking. Then he sat down across from her, and they had dinner in the main room that night for the first time, which had not been a planned thing, just something that happened because Greta had left food on the sideboard, and neither of them had gone to the kitchen. After dinner, he looked at the photograph again. That was taken in 1998, he said. I was 23. I was 22. We'd just finished the North Barn rebuild. We were the only two people there that day who knew how to use a nail gun. She looked at the photograph. He looks like someone who made rooms better, she said. Damien considered that. He did, he said. He was the person who made it feel like something was happening, even when nothing was. He paused. You do that too. She looked at Damien. He was looking at the photograph, not at her, which made it easier for him to say she suspected. I know, she said. He looked at her then. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. That's the difference between you and most people. When you say something, you mean it. He was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something. Okay, she said. The contract we agreed on, he said. Year-round, kitchen and administrative. He paused. I'd like to change the terms. She kept her face neutral. What terms? He held her gaze. He was doing the thing where he thought before he spoke, but he'd already thought this time. She could tell from the quality of the silence that this was not uncertainty, but the final step before saying a thing that had been prepared. All of it, he said. Not an employee arrangement, a partnership, in the operation and in the rest of it. He paused. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm not even asking you to call it what it is. I'm just saying that what this is, what it's been since December, is real. And I'd like it to be permanent if that's something you want. The fire was going. The photograph was on the mantel. Outside, the Voss Legacy Ranch was running in the summer evening, cattle in the south pasture that was going to be certified in 8 months. A new fence line shared with a neighbor who had been an enemy, a young man named Pedro learning what it meant to carry responsibility, a foreman named Curly who had stopped being angry, 300 acres named for a man who had been going to say something important and had not gotten the chance. Elena looked at this man across from her, the one who rinsed his coffee cup, who had kept a letter for 6 years because throwing it away felt wrong, who had sat in a barn at 23 and decided that this land was his to carry, and had carried it ever since, sometimes badly, always seriously, with the particular kind of loyalty that does not perform itself, but shows up every day in what gets done. She thought about what she'd written at 24. I'm not asking you to be sure. I'm just asking you to try. She had written those words to someone who had never gotten to answer. And then life had moved in the strange, indifferent, occasionally exact way that life moves. And she had arrived in December in a place she hadn't known existed, and the words had found their way back to her, and it turned out they were the right words for now, too. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that was quieter than a sigh, but carried the same weight. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They did not reach for each other dramatically. He did not cross the room. She did not move from her chair. What happened was smaller than that and more real. He looked at her with the expression she'd never been able to name, and she looked back at him and something settled between them, the way things settle when they've finally found their level. They sat by the fire until late, talking about the certification timeline and the fence line and what Pedro might be doing in 3 years, and whether Curly and Cal Mercer's ongoing argument about genetics was going to resolve itself or become a permanent feature of the operation. Ordinary things. The things that made up a life when it was running right. At some point she looked at the photograph on the mantel and thought, he would have liked this. Not her and Damien specifically. She couldn't know that, and she was past pretending to know things she didn't. But the ranch running, the expansion, the old dispute dissolved, the room opened. The forward movement. He would have liked the forward movement. That much she was sure of. There's a thing that people do not often talk about when they talk about grief and loss, and the people who disappear before they're finished. The way the things they set in motion keep moving. The ideas they had, the words they said, the small actions they took that seemed minor at the time. James Farrow had found a certification program and brought the paperwork to a friend. He had started a letter he didn't finish. He had made rooms better just by being in them. None of those things stopped when he stopped. They had traveled through strange and indirect routes and had arrived here, in a ranch in Montana, in a summer evening, in a fire going low, and two people sitting beside it deciding to try. That was not comfort exactly. It was not the kind of thing that made loss easier or fair or sensible. James was still dead. The timing was still cruel. The unfinished letter was still unfinished, but the things he'd started were not. Elena thought there was something worth knowing in that, not a lesson that made things better. Just a true thing, what you set in motion does not stop with you. The letters you write find their way. The ideas you have keep moving through the people who carry them. You do not get to see where they end up, and they do not end when you do. She had arrived in December with $43 and a broken past, and the particular desperation of someone who has run out of reasons to stay where they are. She was leaving nothing. She was staying. She was part of something now that had roots going back before her arrival and would go forward past anything she could currently see. That was not the life she had planned at 24. It was better than what she had planned, which was not something she said lightly, because what she had planned at 24 had felt, at the time, like everything. It was just that everything turned out to be smaller than this. The fire burned down. Damien got up and added a log without being asked, because that was the kind of man he was. He noticed what needed doing, and he did it. She watched him do it and thought, yes, that. That is the thing. Not the land or the money or the name above the gate. Not the power or the reputation or the vast acreage that ran in every direction outside these walls. Those things were real and they mattered, and she was not romantic enough to pretend they didn't. But the log on the fire, the rinsed coffee cup, the letter kept for 6 years because throwing it away felt wrong. The thing you do when you think no one is watching that reveals exactly who you are. That was the thing worth staying for. She stayed.